During the COVID-19 pandemic, questions were raised about the responsibility of institutions to speak out in response to statements made by faculty members, particularly in cases where public health was at stake. I'm Stephen Morrissey, managing editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm talking with Evan Mullen, a resident in the Department of Medicine at Stanford University. Dr. Mullen has co-authored a perspective article about academic freedom and institutional obligations. Dr. Mullen, you write in your perspective article that the notion of academic freedom to speak out on issues of public interest can be traced to the Ross affair. So what happened in that case, and what were the implications of decisions to speak or not to speak?
So I think it was quite serendipitous for Dr. Verghese and myself who work at Stanford to discover that academic freedom in the American context really traces back to an affair, the Ross affair, at the turn of the century at our institution. And now this Ross affair had to do with a professor named Edward Ross. He was a professor of sociology, of economics, and I believe also a eugenicist. And he got in hot water with Jane Stanford, who, of course, was one of the founders of the school in 1900. Now, I'd like to point out, in fact, that he had drawn her ire earlier because he was opposed to the railroad industry. Now, of course, Stanford and her husband had made their fortune in the railroad industry. But what really got him in hot water was when he delivered some anti-Asian remarks at a meeting of the United Labor Organization. He actually called for the expulsion of Japanese immigrants. And Stanford used this as a pretext to apply pressure to the president of Stanford at the time, a man by the name of David Starr Jordan, to fire Ross. Now, in his defense, I would say President Jordan declined to do so, but Ross ended up resigning in the ensuing controversy. And one other professor who resigned along with him, a man by the name of Arthur Lovejoy, would go on to be very important in the history of American academic freedom because he was a key member in the establishment of something called the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP. And in 1915, they put out something called the Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure. And this is really the touchstone document in academic freedom in our country. And one of the key themes was protection of academics, protection of faculty members from the intrusion of the university itself, be that into their topics of teaching or even into their public remarks as private citizens.
And then what about academic freedom for institutions? What standards or protections apply to speech by universities?
I think this is a bit murkier. Now, I want to point out that I'm not an expert in academic freedom for institutions so much as I am an amateur with a keen interest here. And based on the research that I've done, it seems as though the early days of academic freedom, that is to say, the days soon after the Ross affair, were really about protection of academics from intrusion of their institutions. That kind of morphed and changed and evolved when we came to the McCarthy era, when the key concern was more protection of intrusion of governments, of politics into the affairs of a university and of its professors. And a key case in the judicial precedent here was a 1957 case called Sweezy versus New Hampshire. This was a case where a professor in New Hampshire was being investigated for communist activities, and he declined to answer questions from, I believe, the Attorney General of the state of New Hampshire regarding things he had said in his lectures, regarding his own personal connections to the communist and Marxist movement. He was initially found to be in contempt, but that was reversed by the Supreme Court. And what is interesting about this case is one of the justices, Felix Frankfurter, who he himself actually was a former professor of law, issued what we would call the unexpectedly expansive concurring opinion. And in this opinion, he really began to draw the lines of academic freedom for the institution itself. And he articulated what are now referred to as sort of the four essential freedoms of a university, namely to determine for itself who may teach, what may be taught, how it shall be taught, and who may be admitted to study. And just actually as an aside here, we didn't have room to fit this into the piece, but I think it's worth mentioning. These four essential freedoms are actually borrowed from a plea from South African scholars who are asking for the academic freedom to do these things in their apartheid regime, namely to teach to all students. So we actually owe them a debt of gratitude in America for articulating our four essential freedoms.
As you say in your article, the inherent tension between the freedom of faculty members to speak without institutional interference and the freedom of institutions to regulate their faculty surfaced again during the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular at Stanford. So could you explain what happened in that situation?
Certainly. So this may be memorable to some of your listeners because it became something of a national conversation. But one faculty member by the name of Dr. Scott Atlas, who was at the time a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and formerly a faculty professor of neuroradiology at Stanford, joined the Trump administration in the second half of 2020 as a COVID-19 advisor. And he made some public pronouncements that really disputed the efficacy of masks as far as preventing viral spread and advocating for a policy of herd immunity and allowing the virus to spread more freely. Now, this public position fairly swiftly drew the condemnation of many of his faculty members at Stanford and across the country, I would say. And it caused, I believe, 98 physicians and researchers to put pen to a public denunciation of this point of view. And as part of that, they called upon the university to speak out and say that it too did not agree with Dr. Atlas's pronouncements. At least initially, however, the university declined to do so. And the president at the time, Dr. Tessier-Levine, wrote a bit of an explanation as to why. And I'll quote him here. He said that the function of the university would be seriously eroded if we were to publicly take sides either to disavow or to support the specific positions of a faculty member engaged in such debates. And this point of view didn't sit well with us, myself and my co-authors. And so we kind of set out to try and understand whether that was a tenable rationale or whether the university should have had the right, insofar as it would be exercising its own academic freedom, to speak up on the same matter as Atlas.
So how do you think such an institutional speech could have contributed to the public debate at that time?
I point out first that the distance between Dr. Atlas's public position and Stanford's internal position was vast. Insofar as Stanford internally was, as many institutions were at the time, espousing a policy of masking, of public distancing, and not in favor of herd immunity as a solution to the issue. And so we believed that, or we still believe, that distancing itself from Atlas would have been beneficial insofar as Atlas was using his credibility, his reputation, as it extended from the reputation of Stanford itself, in order to occupy the position that he did and to influence policy on a national level in the fashion that he did.
So finally, and more globally, when in general should it be considered reasonable or appropriate for an institution to speak out publicly, including against positions taken by its faculty members?
I don't think there is a simple answer to this question. I think this is very thorny, very difficult, and we've seen this in the past few months with all of the events stemming from October 7th and the war in Gaza. I do think our argument is separate but connected here. And I would say that it needs to be a case-by-case basis. One document that I'd like to bring up here is the 1967 Calvin Report, which was a document produced at the University of Chicago in the Vietnam era, which recommended that universities refrain from making public statements on any controversial social or political issue, essentially espousing a position of institutional neutrality. More recently, we've seen several institutions, I think of Syracuse, of Harvard, and most recently of Stanford, who are now espousing more positions of institutional restraint, of having a very high bar to speak up on a matter of controversy. And by no means in our piece are we suggesting that a university should seek to shape public opinion, to lead, to use a bully pulpit, if you will, but rather that exercising its academic freedom means it does have the ability, the right to speak up on matters of public concern. And I think that Yale Law School professor Robert Post put it very succinctly and very beautifully in an essay that he wrote recently on the Calvin Report, where he said, and I quote, "University leaders cannot simply follow rules. They must exercise statesmanship." And so I think, just to reiterate one final time, I don't know when they should or they shouldn't, but I do think that when they should be able to.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen.